Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to our ProcureCon webinar sponsored by GEP, Misalignment in Supply Chain, Procurement, and the Enterprise, How Technology Can Mend the Disconnect. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to bring your attention to the Zoom webinar features in front of you. If you minimize the window, don't worry, simply pop into the toolbar at the bottom of your screen to bring it back up. We'll save some time at the end of today's discussion for live Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions to our speakers at any time during this presentation using the Q&A portal on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Robert Hanfield is the Bank of America Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at North Carolina State University and Director of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative. He is also the author of more than a dozen books on supply chain management and has actively partnered with many Fortune 500 companies. We also have Alex Song, Director of Product Marketing at GEP. Alex has more than 20 years of practical experience as a supply chain leader and has been an advisor to major companies on their digital transformations. Before joining GEP, Alex held multiple supply chain leadership roles at one of the world's largest technology companies. He has hands-on experience in managing procurement, supply chain planning, and execution. We'll also be randomly selecting a few attendees for today's webinar, and we'll be sending a free copy of Dr. Hanfield's new book, Flow. So please keep a lookout for that in the next couple of days after this presentation. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Alex. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Olivia. And again, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. We have a very packed agenda today. I'm sure you'll get a great value out of it. So, Rob, it is an exciting news that your next new book is coming out in just a couple of months. The book has a very interesting title called Flow. This makes me think about Tai Chi, the smoothness of energy and the experience of being in the zone, which seems to be quite different from today's supply chain environment. I think the book came at a perfect time for organizations. Extremely externally, we have a lot of challenges, and internally, that's a tremendous need for capability to orchestrate. So I guess the answer is to have the flow. So Rob, any quick insights you could share with the audience today about the book?
Sure. No, we don't talk about Tai Chi in the book, but we do talk about sort of physics. This is a book that I co-wrote with Tom Linton, the former chief supply chain officer at Flex. And our new book focuses on the importance of, as you said, creating flows in supply chains. So we started writing it early on and talk about the impacts of COVID, of tariffs, as well as the Russian conflict in the Ukraine and the impact on global supply chain flows. And it's, as you say, a very timely discussion given the massive disruptions and shortages that we're seeing in supply chains today, which we'll talk more about in the webinar today.
Yeah, great. I believe readers can benefit a lot from the book. And yes, with everything you just mentioned, we are in a very different place, even compared to just the beginning of the year. So let me talk a little bit about this study itself. The study is actually conducted. We launched the study end of last year. And it's basically, it's conducted in this perfect storm. A disruptive environment means a high level of vibration in the system. And I think the gaps and cracks will easily break the things in the systems. So we actually took a very unique angle in this study with a focus to examine the gaps in the supply chains. So in the study, there were equal number of procurement and supply chain people surveyed, and as well as a good number of IT leaders. Rob, I found that the different companies actually have different notions for procurement versus supply chain. So could you help the audience to understand as well, a little bit better?
Yeah, procurement, as you know, is largely concerned with sourcing agreements, contracting, negotiating, and largely concerned with ensuring market prices are paid and prices are as low as possible. Supply chain executives are often more concerned with logistics, delivery, inventory positions, on-time delivery. And because of the differences between these two groups, sometimes they get into a little bit of conflict. Sometimes there's some heated discussions in the boardroom, perhaps. And I think that's what we're exploring in today's webinar.
All right, so let's look at the key findings from the study. Here's the number one finding. We know that there are some common gaps in supply chains which cause many operation problems. The study found that the number one gap of all the common gaps in the supply chain is the one between procurement and supply chain. So Rob, is this a surprise to you?
As I alluded earlier, this is not really a surprise. And what we're seeing, I believe, are some of the traditional trade-offs that often occur when decisions between procurement and supply chain do not align. All of these gaps suggest that sourcing, may have different priorities from supply chain. And again, procurement, the number one thing that procurement is rewarded on is price, purchase price variance. And supply chain often is evaluated based on inventory turns and on-time delivery, reduction of transportation costs, network performance, et cetera. So, we have one group on one hand that's concerned about buying from the lowest price. The other is focused on delivery and logistics and inventory. Sometimes this can create conflicts or misalignment in decision-making when it comes to designing the supply chain. And as we've seen, I think these are really becoming highlighted in today's economic and disruptive world.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So in order to find out more about the gap, the survey actually asked an interesting question and got some surprising result. So the question is that how would you rate the relative alignment of procurement and supply chain on both sides to procurement and supply chain leaders in the survey? And so this question is about the degree of alignment that they think they have. As you can see, they are quite different in their perception of alignment. For example, the top three items are the areas supply chain leaders think they are most aligned with procurement, but the procurement side think quite differently. Those are the areas they think the least aligned with supply chain. So the point is that they think they are aligned, but actually they are not. Their perception of the reality is quite different while they're working in their silos. So Rob, any key insights regarding these items on the slide?
Well, I think in the end, procurement and supply chain are both on the same team. However, I think they're seeing, that the problems are set off by external events. That includes combination of COVID cases, energy disruptions, labor shortages, misaligned transportation resources, et cetera. But again, because of the different lenses they're using, procurement is looking at, well, can we do it from the lowest cost perspective? Supply chain is often focused on uncertainty and risk, particularly in dealing with the long port lead times, The delays at the ports, the trucker shortages, the significant cost increases in transportation. That's causing some misalignment. And procurement, as we can see, is often prioritizing low-cost suppliers, but often is not penalized for doing so at the expense of higher transportation costs. Whereas supply chain executives are often looking at total cost. So this can create some discrepancies in the way that they look at these problems.
Okay, thanks, Rob, for explaining this. So then in the survey, we ask that what negative outcome they think the gap would bring, right? As you can see, they believe the negative outcome from misalignment hit all top KPIs, including cost, lead time, and risks, right? And some of the things that Robbie just mentioned, I think spot on here. So do you have any additional thought on these outcome?
Well, I think what's happening, in my opinion, is that both procurement and supply chain are being told by their senior executive, by their C-suite, hey, you guys got to get along and work together. And maybe in the past, these kinds of disagreements were acceptable, but they're now being told to work together to address the issue of high inflation and significant supply chain disruptions and increased risk and increased transportation times. And so they can't point fingers at one another anymore. These business impacts are having to be addressed. So for instance, one procurement executive I spoke with at a large CPG company said that they're having to educate their sales force that the cost increases being seen in material costs, in labor costs, and transportation costs can no longer be overcome by productivity improvements and will require that these costs be passed on to customers in higher prices. And that, formerly was verboten in many consumer markets. But that's why we are definitely seeing inflation across the board, is that every single category of material and commodity today is at a record high price. And every single form of transportation is at a record high price. And there's no way to overcome that. And they're having to work together on these issues and readjust budgets and make a number of other changes to deal with that.
Absolutely, and very insightful, Rob. Peter Drucker, the father of modern management, talked about the great divide in the enterprise. It is between demand and supply. Procurement and supply chain gap is a big contributor to this great divide, as it amplifies the gap between suppliers and operations. So if you want to bridge supply and demand gap, it is crucial to solve the gap between procurement and supply chain. And so Rob, could you help the audience to understand why this is even a bigger problem at the current time?
Well, as you point out here, having high inventory, in the past was thought to be the best cure for avoiding shortages. The problem now is that we're seeing disruptions in the supply base. And even though organizations are holding more inventory than ever before, I mean, I'm talking to executives who have 6 months of inventory and stocked away in warehouses. But in many cases, it may not be the right inventory, right? It may not be what they actually need to meet customer demand. And so it's starting to expose a lot of flaws in not only procurement strategies, but also flaws in the transportation networks. We've gone on for so long with these global supply chains, we've kind of got to the point where we just assume that we click a button in Amazon and the product shows up. Yeah. Not anymore. We're seeing bullwhip effects. We're seeing shortages. We're seeing logistics providers that cannot get material. And this requires that we solve these problems. And how you solve these problems, you have data. You need data available to the parties to evaluate it and we need joint problem solving that brings together supply planners, demand planners to address these issues. These are complex issues, and they're going to require some more thoughtful solutions to help address them.
Thanks, Rob. So as we talk, this is the first very interesting finding from the survey. So at this point, Olivia, we have a polling question. Could you launch that question, please? Question number 1. Yeah, let's just do question number 1.
So, this is a quick poll, Alex, just to see if most people believe that supply and procurement are aligned. There was a comment from the audience. Would in supplier selection, would the supply chain map the total cost of an operation to be the basis of supplier selection? Theoretically, yes, that would be the case, but not always, right? Not everyone does a total cost analysis. And I've seen this happen where procurement is just rewarded on the purchase price variance. The transportation cost is left up to the supply chain group. And I think what we see here in our response is it's roughly about 50-50. 49% say yes, 51% say no. And that's an interesting that it's a perfect split right along the center.
Excellent. So let's move on. Now we've seen the gap between procurement and supply chain, and let's look a little bit further within the organizations. So on this slide, as you can see, the result shows that procurement's top priority is cost, while that of supply chain is delivery. And Rob, again, I think, is it surprising to you?
Again, I think that this is not very surprising. I recall a situation where a large industrial manufacturer procurement was being rewarded for purchase price variance, was using suppliers in low-cost countries, and the transportation costs of getting that material to that facility was double the labor variance in that facility. So the transportation costs were through the roof. And so any savings achieved by going overseas were, evaporated in light of the significant transportation costs. So I think very often, cost and delivery sometimes are working at odds, and it requires that, group procurement supply chain work, as someone pointed out, to work towards the lowest total cost solution.
Yeah, that was a great comment. And interestingly, actually, they basically, if you look at the top two priorities, they basically agree in their top two priorities. But when you look closer, right, the order of number 1 and number 2 exactly flipped. So that means they mostly in agreement, and yet not always. In a normal environment, it is probably okay, I think, right? 90% of the time might work out. But in a disruptive environment, it could be very different. And so again, Rob, help us to understand that in today's supply chain context.
Well, what we're seeing at, the U.S. reported, 7% inflation last month. Also, Jason Miller from Michigan State and I developed something called the Supply Chain Pressures Index, which is on my blog. And this index shows that there are significant shortages of material, labor, and transportation that are reducing the effective capacity of production. So, people are being hammered. So resiliency is definitely a topic that's top of mind. As I said, I'm not a huge fan of the term resiliency. I really like the term supply chain immunity, and that implies that you need to be prepared for any attack on your system, attack on your body. Resiliency often implies carrying lots of redundancy and inventory, whereas immunity is achieved through visibility, through agility, and being able to fight back against these disruptions. So, as we described in our flow book, Flex, for instance, was able to integrate systems and by having good data quality, they had a good foundation for building a real-time inventory visibility system. And also by working with third-party providers, on risk management, they could also get good visibility on risk events that could impact their ability to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think it's interesting you mentioned resiliency versus immunity. But what's really surprising here, right, is that resiliency here only ranked number 3. The major research GEP conducted last year, including Harvard Business Review and The Economist, all showed consistently that resilience is the top priority. And that is also consistent in major Gartner reports. And they even pointed out this is a requirement from CEOs. So this is really a puzzle that it's only ranked number 3 in this survey. So the team went on and conducted deeper analysis with different angles, including the industry angle, the size of the company, geographic locations, and so forth. And some fascinating insights were revealed. It discovered that the companies that focus on technology advancement tend to rank resilience as a higher priority. And that means the companies seeing the right priority in resilience are those also understand the power of technology. And I believe those are the ones winning in their space. So Rob, you have any additional comments?
Yeah, absolutely. This makes sense, Alex. Resiliency is a term that I think people are throwing around a lot right now without perhaps really understanding, the implications of resiliency. We dug into the data a little bit, and what we found is that, the technology leaders are determined by investments in digital technology transformation, are better able, are more focused on resiliency. And what this shows is that, you can't go without data and insights to really figure out what's going wrong in your supply chain. And to do that, you have to be able to really determine what's happening in that supply chain through digital investments. And Exhibit A is, the LA port, which today operates largely through emails and Excel spreadsheets. And what is really required is digital visibility into incoming cargo, outbound transportation, trucking, and data sharing to enable dispatching, scheduling, and pickups. And this is what major ports around the world, like Hong Kong and Rotterdam and Dubai, have done. And so I think we need to make those digital investments in not only our port infrastructure, but our logistics infrastructure as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. Big data is such an opportunity for procurement and supply chain leaders to get where they want to be. And another finding in this deep analysis is even more interesting when we look into the organizations. As you can see, the CSCOs, the Chief Supply Chain Officers, and CPOs, the Chief Procurement Officers, actually see resilience as the top of their priority, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing here is that the C-suite executives are talking a lot to their other C-suite peers, and are talking about, we're going to develop a resilient supply chain. The guys on the ground who are dealing with the tactical reality of expediting, chasing down parts, problems in operations, in transportation, and shortages. They're focused on the tactical issues of delivery, tracking shipments, calling up suppliers, expediting, dealing with shortfalls. This is a nightmare if you're a demand or a supply planner. And what does resiliency mean to you? It just means long overtime days and trying to deal with these shortfalls. I think as we say with the idea of flows, as we start focusing on flows and speeds as the elements that drive corporate balance sheets and supply chain performance, this alignment of technology to enable these people to deal with the visibility of what's happening in supply chains will become even more important than ever.
Yeah, and I think it is great that the C-level, right, executive have the important vision, but they, as you said, they might not know that the business actually is in a autopilot mode, and it continue to run its course as usual. So I really hope this is a wake-up call for organizations that for those they want to go on a different track.
And just to to follow up, there's one comment in the chat. What do we mean by resilience? I think people think about resilience as having redundancy, having lots of inventory, having lots of buffers to deal with. And again, there's no guarantee that having those buffers and redundancy will work unless you have visibility and agility to be able to respond to problems. And I think that's why this idea of, I like the term supply chain immunity a lot more than resilience.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a little bit about kind of a recap on misalignment. Rob, you have any further insights?
Yeah, I think there's a lot happening right now. There's a lot happening to procurement and supply chain. I think they're having to make some very difficult decisions. They're dealing with procurements faced with massive inflation, record prices surging at the current time. Concurrently, the ports and transportation delays are shutting down factories. The port of Shanghai is shut down. Shanghai as a whole is shutting down. So these global supply chains are really struggling. Unfortunately, we don't see this changing in 2022, and it may not even change in 2023. And so I think there could be we could be looking at an extended period of time when it comes to this.
Yeah, I think look at how they behave, right? It's a bit like instinct to struggle harder when sink into a quicksand. And also I think it's kind of a misperception issue too. The top executive might think the people reporting to them are in alignment, but the reality is that they see further down the future, but their teams are still buried in the current situation. And so getting current business outcome is not a problem. I think the problem is the cost to business in the long term. So Rob, do you have any advice to people in this challenging environment?
Well, I think cost management is really going to be important. And to address cost management, it requires collaboration. I don't think you can beat up on suppliers, but you might have to do things like value analysis, standardization, working on alternative sources of supply. This is hard work. And also, addressing transportation problems will require using things like supply chain mapping, working with bottlenecks, understanding where the constraints are in your supply chain and solving them one by one. So again, all of these require data. So, organizations, I think, are going to have to start mapping out supply chains and capturing data on what's going on. And, I think the war in the Ukraine is simply making that situation worse, additional constraints. And we're also going to see constraints, from other things like climate change, wildfires, earthquakes, hurricanes. Those won't go away on their own. So, these disruptions will continue to impact these global supply chains, and we need to find a better way to manage them.
Okay, thanks. And I think before we move on further, right? If we can talk a little bit about resiliency, just because it's a term that a lot of people are using. I know you like to use immunity as a term better, but could you educate us a little bit further on resiliency?
Well, I think the popular press has said that, organizations moved away from resiliency because they relied more on just in time. I think resiliency, in a sense, slows down supply chains, or, and is the enemy of speed and of flow and of working capital improvement. But I think, what we need to do is we can improve our agility to disruptions, our response, by using tools that can penetrate deep into supply chains and map the movement. And as we start building that visibility, we don't need to necessarily harden our supply chains by simply, using more inventory or using redundancy, et cetera. I think we are also starting to see a movement towards more domestic shoring, whether it's onshoring or nearshoring, et cetera. And, I think there was another comment, for instance, that someone talked about how investments into digital visibility can be offset by the savings. There may or may not be savings, but the savings, I think, are going to occur in the improved responsiveness, which is going to save you money down the road. And so that business case has to be made to, your chief financial officer, who's going to approve that spending. But I think, suddenly supply chain is in the spotlight, and that CFO may be very well positioned to be able to listen to what your business case is.
Yeah, I agree. Very often, right? I think from the learning from this study so far, I think we are hampered by old way of thinking, and so supply chain leaders actually definitely need to communicate clearly what they want the team to accomplish, right? Whether driving speed, delivery, agility, visibility, or resiliency, and clearly define what resiliency really mean for their organization, right? And to help them really focus on their mission.
Well, that's right. And I think, resiliency, again, is about sort of building up your inventory and creating buffers. Agility, or what I call immunity, requires you have better market intelligence, you have better market signals, you have better supply market intelligence. So you're paying attention to what's happening around the world, and you're able to take those signals and convert them into actions. And I think that's going to be the new imperative for global supply chains, is to become more digitally aware of what's happening in their global supply chains.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So now we've looked at the gaps between and also within the organizations, right? Let's see a bigger picture in the enterprise. Here again, we see the difference between procurement and supply chain when they consider the top enterprise priority. And Rob, would you help us to understand, and so we see the difference here?
Well, I think, both of these groups are relatively well aligned in terms of their priorities. More and more organizations are focusing on diversity in their workforce, in their supply base, for a very simple reason. Increased diversity in the workforce and your supply base creates above average performance on projects and on business outcomes. Diversity is no longer just an afterthought or check the box to a corporate strategy. Many organizations are targeting diversity as a core part of their enterprise strategy, not just as a feel-good measure. The other thing with sustainability is, sustainability is really becoming an important issue in the financial markets, where ESG investors are really looking at people's carbon footprint, and they're starting to use science-based targets. And that's flowing down to, the supply chain and saying, where are you sourcing your materials? what is your carbon footprint associated with the distance traveled for your shipments? And that's consistent with the need to develop more local sources of production, which is also ranked number 4 by our supply chain executives.
So what should they do differently, Rob?
Well, I think both priorities are critical. And in some ways, they're very much related and can be part of the same set of actions. I think it requires creating awareness within your organization and providing a business rationale for the changes that need to occur.
All right, I think so far we have some good, very engaging discussion with the audience as well. Here are some key insights for the audience. So number 1 here, supplier diversity is not simply a policy, or we call it box checking. It needs to bring true business value, right, in savings and in innovation. And I think the second is to make supplier diversity a real value. Companies need to share information, skills, and outcomes with their suppliers and include them in the process, right, through collaboration. Rob, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think these are really important findings. And as I said, diversity is a business strategy now that requires that your company and your supply chain be a good representative or be representative of your customer base and your supply base. And this is really about being inclusive to all individuals who can all contribute to our outcomes. And this is just a simple good business principle. McKinsey has data that shows that companies with the top 25% of diversity scores have above average profitability. And the opposite goes for laggards as well. So, to really achieve diversity requires really, pulling the heart of the mind together. It's not a loosey-goosey issue. We have to appeal directly to the hearts and minds of the people working in our organizations. And it's not just about awarding business, to diverse suppliers with RFQs. It's about making it part of normal business decisions.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Supplier diversity should be considered in this bigger picture. And a matter of fact, I saw a top trend in recent studies that diversity is actually being absorbed into DEI initiative, and then further into ESG initiative. And some people are actually concerned, especially the people actually running these diversity programs. They are concerned concerning that the program be getting lost, right? But I think it is a great opportunity to make it even bigger, right, and make it meaningful as an enterprise priority. Because most of the sustainability value incurred in supply chain, it requires good alignment and collaboration between procurement and supply chain to drive sustainability activities. And also, I think as number 3 here mentioned, right, insights, it is a great opportunity for supply chain and procurement truly working together. So it's time for our second polling question. Olivia, could you launch that question, please? So the question is, what is your most important enterprise priority at the moment?
And I've got a hypothesis. I think I'm going to bet on sustainability. I think that's the one that's going to come out.
Let's see. I guess that's probably I would bet on too.
Okay, we'll see where it lands. And again, just to reiterate that point, ESG investors are going to drive your share price, and that's going to impact your C-suite, and your C-suite is going to look to procurement and say, what are you guys doing to reduce our carbon footprint, right? And
wow.
Sustainability and collaboration are tied.
Wow, that's even better, Rob. Sometimes come out something even better than we expect. I really think sustainability, cope with collaboration. It's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Okay. Yeah. So great. So move on to next. So we've seen the multiple levels of misalignment, right? In the disruptive environment, it could cause major problems for the business. So looking at
this is a very powerful figure, Alex. I think it illustrates how we need to create alignment across the business and ensure common messaging, common objectives, and bringing people together to address common outcomes. And if we do those things, then the profitability will follow.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want the audience just have a quick takeaway from this slide, right? As you can see, based on the findings from the survey, we know that between supply chain and procurement, right, as two organizations, two teams, they have misalignment between the two. And within each of the organizations, they have misalignment as well, right? And as individual business functions, they even have different views in their top enterprise priorities. And so these actually presented very interesting insights for us to be aware, right? I think it's very important to be aware what kind of alignment exists in our business. All right. So to build a supply chain more resilient, right? People are talking about integration, but I believe it is not simply about integration. It's about a larger scale convergence. It is an organic convergence, happens at the deeper level. So it's clear, as you can see here, that the visibility and collaboration are the top pain points today. And this is consistent with other analysts' findings. And basically, business needs capability to both see and to act.
Yeah, this is no surprise here, and I think it's also worth noting here that procurement and supply chain may or may not be in the same reporting structure, and that may be partly responsible for some of the challenges. Procurement may respond to finance, supply chain may respond to marketing, and that may be a divergence. In either case, I think, to have good visibility and collaboration requires that you have solid data governance. And that's a common approach for coding and standardizing data with a solid data foundation. And that's all critical, to be able to establish that basis for visibility and collaboration.
Yeah, people talking about removing off from Excel sheets, right? And that's absolutely, business need to do. And it's important to move operations off the complete dependency on spreadsheets. But it's also important to know where they are moved to, right? So it is a strategic question. The focus of visibility and collaboration from the study actually give us a very valuable direction. Next, the study actually give us an even more intriguing and insightful finding. So as you can see on this slide, the top three bars that you can see, it's great to see that all the C-level executives are agreeing on visibility. They all think, whether it's CIO or CSCO or CPO, they all agree that visibility is very important in today's environment, right? And CIO even goes a little bit further, make an even stronger statement there, right? But however, the divergence actually happened when you look at collaboration and the analytics, the second and third bar on the chart. And I think collaboration and analytics are very action-oriented capability to drive business outcome. And so on this, yeah, Rob, you have any comments?
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. I mean, visibility requires having, good dashboards and good control towers to be able to pull the data that you need into a format, where it can be visualized. And this also requires people who know how to interpret the data and, as you say, act on it. What we see a lot is supply chain officers and procurement officers often blame IT. They say, well, IT isn't giving us the software that we require. But in reality, I don't think you need huge software investments. It's about defining the problem, defining the data, creating mechanisms to collect the data, to visualize it in unique ways. And as we documented in our book, Flex designed a real-time visibility system for under $500,000. And they had to define what the problem was and started creating visualizations around that to enable people to act on it, and then publish that data in a format that could be used by everyone. So I think that this idea of visibility and collaboration go hand in hand. People need data to be able to solve a problem. You can't manage what you can't see.
Very well said, Rob. So I want to stress this insightful finding for both IT leaders and supply chain procurement leaders. Technology is such a critical enabler for business. So IT leaders need to really pay full attention to the changing needs from the business side and operations, right? To ensure they align and provide the most needed support. Any thoughts on that, Rob?
Absolutely. I think, as I said earlier, people need to be able to, when there's a problem that arises, when there's a disruption on the horizon, people need to get into a virtual war room and quickly be able to access data that can inform them about the current state. And using that data, they can then collaborate on how to address the problem and how to address the issue. And for the supply chain disruptions that we are seeing today, and which we will continue to see, we need to have access to real-time data and collaboration between people who are working the supply chain to quickly respond and be agile in addressing these issues.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's critically important, right? So on the journey, many of us on the journey of digitization or building resiliency and moving into the future, right? It is very important for, again, IT leaders also to be aligned and work together with procurement and supply chain leaders. So it's time for our third polling question. Olivia, could you to launch that question, please? So the third question is that, do you think your company IT function is well aligned with supply chain organization?
And I think this is a good, a good question. I think there's an interesting comment here from Dupree Jones. Without buy-in on investing in supply chain data governance, which is required from the IT group, it's difficult to have a software platform that can deliver required visibility. So your IT function may be the one that's required to help build that effective data warehouse, data mart capability that can provide you with the data for these visibility tools.
Yeah, good. So now, okay, 70% of the audience said no, we're not really aligned. Yeah. So I guess that's not a surprise. It's pretty much I think consistent with our study, right?
Right. Yeah, and IT is blamed a lot for a lot of different things, but I think we have to be able to sort of grab the reins and manage part of that process ourselves as well.
Yeah. Okay. So next one, let's look at together. This is a question and answer based on what they think, what kind of technology they need, right? As we can see here, flexible workflow is important in a resilient and agile environment to drive actions, right? And also it's interesting to see that master data management actually ranked high. I guess it's due to the pains that people often experience in managing data quality. Rob, you have any thoughts? I think, yeah, I know you have quite a bit of research on that topic.
Yeah, we run an annual survey on data governance and data quality, and I think you can see here that having that data quality is really important. If you have data that's garbage, you won't trust it and you won't act on it. So we need we need cleansed data. We need data that we can trust, and that's clear. I think to have workflow mapping to understand where things are in our supply chain, we need to have good master data on top of that. In general, it's good news. Master data is getting better, but it's getting better slowly based on our results. So it continues to be a problem in many organizations today.
Yeah, I think that the message is loud and clear. What we need, what needed in our business. So to build a strong and resilient supply chain, we need the right technology convergence, and the convergence between process, human, and technologies as well. So speaking the capability for collaboration, let's talk a little bit more here. In GEP's view, right? A technology-enabled holistic, or we call 360 collaboration, is what companies need in today's environment, so that organizations and processes can greatly converge and work together effectively. And a second here, I think, is that real-time, flexible, workflow-driven, exception management-oriented, and modular aspects are very important aspects, and they can be actually achieved by technology today. Any practical advice, Rob?
Well, I think in this case, each functional area would ideally have a dashboard of data that they can use to drive collaboration, and then to be able to reach out to others in the ecosystem, including suppliers, transportation providers, et cetera. So that's sort of a desired future state that I think we want to get to over time.
Good. I think we are about time to wrap up. So I think we've talked quite a bit in today's webinar. The key message is about convergence. Removing misalignment. We've looked at quite a few misalignments, right? Removing misalignment and the gaps in the system is particularly important in a volatile and violent environment. And convergence, I believe, is the path, but it doesn't simply mean putting two parts together. As someone said, don't glue together Lego, right? It should involve different levels of organization, technology, and process. It is to connect the parts organically, and so that the flow, right? We talk about flow. So the flow can happen, right? Which we mentioned earlier. So the flow can actually happen. Yeah. Additional thoughts, Rob?
Well, I think convergence is indeed a multidimensional component of outcomes that include sustainability, resiliency, and profitability. It will require a change in culture. Employees need to be able to act based on data, and leaders need to be able to trust their employees to act based on data. And I think having that greater independence through real-time data will enable quicker action, which will lead to that improved agility and immunity that we've been talking about here today.
Yeah.
But it's going to require a shift in our thinking as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And practically, right, from technology perspective, it needs to be balanced, right, to foster both visibility and collaboration, as we talked, both, seeing and responding, what we call acting. On this slide, as you can see, it's like almost like a bird needs two wings to fly, right? But ultimately, I think it is not about bridging gaps or convergence. It is to really create a body of business, right, to fit for the environment. It's really based on the rules of survival of the fittest, right? And as a society, we've had decades of technology emergence, right? But to survive and succeed in the disruptive environment, I think convergence should be the theme for the next decade. To allow convergence to happen, we all need to learn to be inclusive in many aspects, right? So I think this pretty much wrapped up our finding, and it's time for a few questions from the audience.
Great, yes, and thank you to our audience for asking some great questions. I think we only have a few minutes to ask just a couple. So our first question is from Martin. He's asking, how good are procurement and SC aligned when it comes to day-to-day supplier management, i.e. R&Rs?
Yeah, that's a great question, Martin. I think that there is some gaps that exist today. I think there's always been a gap, again, because of the different performance objectives that those groups are tied to. I think we're starting to see organizations say, hey, you guys need to get along. And not only that, but you need to be more aligned in discussing that. And I think as some organizations move to category management, they'll start bringing in supply chain professionals, transportation professionals, import-export professionals, et cetera, into those teams to make better informed sourcing decisions. So I think there's a change afoot. It may not be present in all the organizations that are out there yet.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Courtney. And she's asking, did your study only analyze organizations where SC and procurement are separate, or were organizations where procurement was under the SC function? Curious if there was a difference in priorities aligning depending upon organizational structure.
Hi, Courtney. That's a great question. We may not have had the data to be able to answer, the organizational placement of procurement supply chain. But you make a great point. In some organizations, logistics and transportation reports up to procurement. In others, procurement reports to finance, supply chain reports to marketing. In either case, there may be different, objectives that they're focused on. If they report to marketing, then it's likely going to be a highly revenue-focused set of objectives. If it's finance, it's likely to be purchase price variance and cost of goods sold focused. So you're going to definitely see, shifts in priorities based on who's reporting to whom and what departments they're reporting up to. I think that's something that we could definitely look at in our next study, right, Alex?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, Rob, it's even, I think this is a good question, right? If you look at some organization, if they're not even very clearly divide between the two organizations, that even be a better opportunity for them to work together, right? Converge, right? But I think people tend to work in their own silos, their processes. And that's why this study finding really kind of alerted us, right? We really need to really walk out of like our routine to push the collaboration and convergence. Olivia, I think we probably have time for one or two questions.
Sure, let's answer one more last question. This one's from Dupree. They're saying, I'm challenged with educating finance, investor relations, FP&A, and executives on pressures from shipping as well.
Yeah, I think educating our finance people and also educating our sales people is something that I'm hearing from a lot of supply chain executives. And so there are some customers like in healthcare who are just saying, we're not accepting any cost increases, period. Well, how do you deal with that situation when you've got 7% inflation, when you've got transportation cost increases, when you have labor shortages? So I think it's a matter of having to educate people to say, look, there are no options here. We cannot absorb these costs into our margins. Our margins are not able to sustain that. And I think that's why we're seeing inflation starting to go up. And I think honestly, we're seeing that as inflation goes up, customers are willing to pay it. My observation is that customers don't seem to mind paying more for their groceries, for their gas. It hasn't impacted demand. So we have inelastic demand, which I think is also an interesting thing that's happening in today's economy.
Great.
Okay, well-
Yeah, great. I think these are very good questions, and I'm afraid we have a lot more. So, Olivia, but it's time to close, right? Thank you very much for a very engaging audience today. And we might have some additional discussions on LinkedIn. Rob and I can look into possibility to host some discussions further. For I know there are probably a lot more questions in the audience, and we can even expand to have a bigger conversation.
Yes, I agree. We have lots of still questions that are unanswered. We will definitely try to get back to you as soon as possible with some answers from you. You can also look forward to receiving this presentation and on-demand access within 24 hours, so keep a lookout for that. And again, like we said before, we'll be randomly selecting attendees to receive a free copy of Dr. Hanfield's new book, so please keep a lookout for that as well. And I wanted to say just a huge round of applause and thank you to our speakers, Dr. Hanfield and Alex today. Fantastic job. Please remember to leave us feedback and suggestions for us in the survey at the close of this webinar. And we'll use that feedback to guide us in producing upcoming webinar topics. So with that, I'll bring this program to an end. On behalf of ProcureCon, GEP, and the WR Insights team, we thank you for your time. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Stay well. Stay safe. Stay well.